So hello and welcome to another episode of Biographics. It's just a mouse. Someone's going to see that and they're not going to be able to look away. It's the mouse to scroll on my teleprompter, don't worry about it. But yes, as mentioned, this is another episode of Biographics with me, your interim host, Karl Smallwood. And today we're talking about Francis Galton, the father of eugenics. And the original article this video is based on was by one Arnoldo Teodrani. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. If I'm not, yell at me in the comments. But definitely go check out their links below and let's get to it. I should cook my own thing, shouldn't I? Alright. Let's rock. You know what? Let's rock. That'll be my thing. No. I'm cool. Great Britain in the 19th century was a hotbed for scientific and technological innovations. Scholars, scientists, inventors and theorists of the age had laid the foundations for many of the wonders of the 20th century and the contemporary era. Not all these inventions and ideas were for the better, however. Even if conceived with the best of intentions in mind, they would pave the way for some of the worst horrors that would darken the skies of Europe and beyond. One such concept was defined at the time as, and I quote, the science of the improvement of the race. Or the science of improving stock. Just saying that out loud makes me feel dirty. I feel so dirty saying that out loud. Ugh. But I'll power through. In both cases, the author of these definitions were referring to the human race and human stock. The author of those quotes was also the originator of a science whose nefarious influences would impact millions of innocent lives in Germany, the US, and Sweden, among countless other countries. This is the story of Sir Francis Galton, the father of eugenics. Francis Galton was born February 16, 1822, the seventh child of banker Samuel Tertius Galton and Frances Anna Violetta Darwin, quite ironically named, I guess, given his later contributions to science. Francis' father was Erasmus Darwin, grandfather of Charles Darwin. Francis and Charles were in fact cousins. Okay, so I guess it's not so much ironic as just a weird coincidence, that history sometimes has. Francis showed great promise for science from a very early age. His older siblings described him as a child prodigy who could read at the age of 2, memorise poetry at 5, and could discuss the Iliad at 6. The little know-it-all, however, did not fare as well as expected in school. Perhaps bored by the constraints of the traditional education system, he achieved little success and caused numerous disciplinary issues. At the age of 16, Francis's parents decided to remove him from school. He clearly showed no aptitude for formal studies, so in a perfectly rational move, they sent him off to Birmingham to study medicine. After 2 years of inconclusive studies in Birmingham and London, Francis dropped from medical school, a win for generations of future patients, and in 1840 he enrolled himself instead at Trinity College, Cambridge, to study mathematics. During his first 2 years at Cambridge, Francis did what many students excel at: drinking, partying, and generally hanging out with their mates, either on a boat or hiking through the countryside. Tell you now, I did not do much hiking. In his third year, Francis decided to give it a go at, studying. Again, very common for students in Britain. He did put a significant effort into preparing for his exams, ranking second best in his entire school. But his mental exhaustion, combined with the disappointment of not ranking first, caused Francis to experience a nervous breakdown, followed by depression. That's just the path of all gifted kids, isn't it? Of just finally coming up to the limit of what you can achieve and just not being able to handle it. Francis left Cambridge with a Pole degree, which is the lowest possible degree to achieve a pass. He maintained a love for mathematics throughout his life, but his bout of depression may have pushed him to choose fields in which there was very little in the way of academic competition, such as statistics. In the immediate aftermath of his graduation, Francis resumed his medical studies, which were interrupted abruptly on October 23rd, 1844, when his father, Samuel, died. Francis would later study the traits which are inherited by children from their parents. In this case, Francis inherited something very important: a lot of cash, which he soon put to good use. In Galton's own words, at the time he felt much upset and craving for a healthier life. Having plenty of money and spare time in his hands, Francis decided to pursue a healthier life by travelling to Africa and the Middle East. Galton reached Egypt in the autumn of 1845, running into two friends from Cambridge, Hedsworth Berkeley and Montague Bolton. They are some Cambridge names right there. Galton's travels in Egypt and the Levant would deserve an entire book of their own, so I'll just give you some highlights. Galton and friends travelled by boat and by camel from Cairo to Khartoum, modern-day Sudan. Along the way, Galton parted ways with his two friends, but replaced them with a couple of monkeys. Then Francis and his simian companions boarded a steamer to Lebanon, and from there they travelled to Damascus, Jaffa and Jerusalem. Throughout his travels, Galton was at serious risk of getting injured or killed several times. For example, when his raft capsized in the River Jordan, or when his caravan was attacked by bandits at night who luckily contented themselves with just stealing some horses, but not his monkeys. Galton returned to Britain in November 1846. Still craving for a healthier life, Francis spent 1847 and 1848 and much of 1849 hunting and shooting. Then he learned about the travels of one David Livingstone in southern Africa, which inspired him to follow in the explorer's footsteps. After securing an endorsement for the Royal Geographical Society, Galton sailed off towards Cape Town in April 1850. Again, one book would not be enough to cover Galton's explorations. In fact, he wrote 2 books about them: Tropical South Africa, published in 1852, and The Art of Travel in 1855. Both publications were very successful. The latter was reprinted several times, and the former earned Galton a medal from the Royal Geographical Society and a fellowship of the Royal Society. During his travels, Galton exploited his mathematical skills to the fullest. For example, he used boiling point thermometer readings to estimate the height of mountains, and then used the lunar distance method to calculate the accurate longitude and latitude of the geographical landmarks he encountered. But he also applied mathematics to the measurements of human features. This approach would later form the basis of the science of biometrics, another field of study that Galton is credited with originating. He would later study the characteristics of fingerprints and their applications to criminology, but more on this later. As he journeyed through southern Africa, however, Galton was interested in other areas of the human body when he came across local women with very large breasts. Apparently, he devised a method to estimate the size of their chest by triangulating other dimensions in their bodies. Francis Galton returned to Britain in April 1852, preceded by a scientific paper detailing the Namibian leg of his travels. Despite the niche nature of the publication, Galton became something of a celebrity in London. Feeling exhausted by both the African adventure and the excessive attention, Galton escaped first to Norway for a fishing trip and then to Dover. There, on January 5th, 1853, he met Lou, or Louise Jane Butler. Francis was smitten with Louis and initiated a courtship which eventually led to marriage. Or as Galton wrote in his diary, left Dover in March, engaged in April, spirit rapping mania, married in August. He certainly had a knack for summaries. The two married on August 1st, 1853, and after a honeymoon in Switzerland and Italy, they settled in Victoria Street, London. The Galtons would not have any children of their own, but Francis did leave an enduring mark on the world through his numerous scientific endeavours across a broad range of fields. He played an active role in the governance of the Royal Society, the Royal Geographical Society, and the British Association of the Advancement of Science. Galton also conducted and published numerous important investigations in meteorology, being credited with the discovery of the anticyclone effect and the drafting of the first weather map. Pursuing his interest in biometrics, Galton also wrote 3 monographs on the use of fingerprints as a feature to identify unique individuals, a body of work which greatly influenced the budding field of criminology. Galton also showed interest in less conventional research, for example, publishing an article for Nature in which he proved the best method to cut a cake so it could be preserved for up to 3 days. Here is how you do it. You have to slice all the way through the diameter of the cake so you extract a long, thin, rectangular slice. Then you have to press the reduced but still semicircular halves of the cake together. This will seal in moisture and ensure the cake will remain fluffy and delightful for up to 3 days. Galton's passions, however, were mostly devoted to numbers, measurements, and statistics. Counting was second nature to him. He counted everything, everywhere, worked out statistics, and published his findings. For example, he developed a model to assess the level of engagement in scientific meetings by measuring the frequency at which delegates fidgeted at lectures, and he invented a counting device, a small pocket ticker, which he used to calculate the frequency of attractive women walking on the streets of London. Galton's knack for measurements informed studies on his next passion, heredity. He tackled this field in a quantitative manner, an approach which laid the foundations for the science of biostatistics and later eugenics. Drawing inspiration from his cousin Charles Darwin's work, The Origin of Species, Galton sought to understand whether human mental traits could be inherited and if they could be influenced by nature or artificial selection. To this end, he performed a statistical analysis on the biographical dictionaries, seeking to determine how frequently talented people were related to other noteworthy individuals. He then compared this frequency with that of eminent people emerging from undistinguished and unknown backgrounds. At the time, his studies were unique in their kind and led him to draw the following conclusions, and I quote once again: "Talent and peculiarities of character are found in the children when they have existed in either of the parents to an extent beyond all question greater than the children of ordinary persons." In other words, according to Galton, mental characteristics were determined more by heredity than environment, more by nature than nurture. Francis published his findings in 2 articles, Hereditary Talent and Character, published in 1865, and Hereditary Genius in 1869. In the latter article, he surveyed 300 families of noteworthy individuals, claiming that 31% of them had a prominent father, and 38% had a prominent son. I do wonder how really rich families ended up having prominent children. I do wonder how having all that money resulted in the children ended up being noteworthy and exceptional themselves. It must just be good genetics. It can't be access to anything else. Another conclusion he drew is that social distinction, i.e. the capability to succeed in life, depended mostly from naturally inherited talent. Galton, however, admitted that even a gifted individual needed some degree of elbow grease to fully succeed, stating, and I quote once again, "If a man possesses great intellectual value, if he has the desire to work and in the capacity to work too, I do not see how such a man could be suppressed." Galton, let me introduce you to something known as the working class. As he continued his studies in heredity, in 1872, Galton introduced the concept of stirps, the Latin word for root. He defined a stirp as a set of elements which transmit characters from one generation to the next. An individual's stirp, therefore, is directly formed from a combination of their parents' stirps. This belief led Galton to his next conclusion, that the human race could be improved in the same way that breeders and farmers improve the stock of their farm animals. In his own words, once again, a 20th part of the cost and pains were spent in measures for the improvement of the human race, that is spent on the improvement of the breed of horses and cattle. Then, science could be able to produce a galaxy of genius. And I don't think I need to, explain why that's wrong, right? According to this new theory, the key to improvement of humankind was not about improving environmental conditions for new generations. No, the solution was selective breeding. This was the basis of eugenics. To prove his theory on inheritance patterns, in 1877, Galton conducted a series of investigations on sweet peas, seeking to determine if plant size and quality were inherited. Along the way, he made an important discovery in the field of biostatistics. He found that regardless of the parent strain, some of the child plants were the same quality as the mum and dad pea. Some were much worse, but the majority were a little worse. This concept was formalised as regression towards the mean, the process by which a random variable outside the norm eventually tends to return to the norm. Now, in theory, this finding should have realistically invalidated Galton's insights on heredity. If applied to humans, this means that regardless of how brilliant and talented your parents are, you're more likely to go into an average Joe or average Jane than becoming a Nobel Prize winner. But Galton ignored his own conclusions and continued to insist that good stock as a predictor of future success. In his next seminal work, Inquiries into Human Faculty, of 1883, Galton first introduced the term eugenics, composed from the Greek words for good and growing. In Inquiries, he defined eugenics as, and I quote, "the science of improvement of the race." A science which dealt with, and I quote once again, "all the influences likely to give the more gifted races a greater chance of prevailing over the less good races." A science conceived to, and I quote once more, "give the more suitable races or strains of blood a better chance at prevailing speedily over the less suitable." According to Dominique Aubert-Marson, lecturer at Paris Descartes University, Galton used the term race as a substitute for nationality. In the specific case of his 1883 publication, he focused on the English race, which he divided into 3 social classes. Oh, this is going to be fun. First, the desirables, a class encompassing the aristocracy and elites in general. Yes, the desirables. Has anyone seen what our king looks like right now? Can we put a picture of King Charles behind us, or just his fingers? That looks to me like good breeding stock. Then he had the middle classes, not particularly gifted, but still considered productive for society. And then finally, the undesirables. Joe Schmo right here, or the poorer classes, the people who actually do all of the work. Galton's view that poverty was determined biologically, because of course, to remove poverty and reorganise English society, he advocated using artificial selection, because natural selection was ineffective on human populations. How ironic that he didn't have a kid. Francis Galton followed up the publications of Inquiries by launching an initiative to gather intergenerational data on humans. In 1884, he founded the Anthropometric Laboratory at the Southern Kensington Science Museum. This essentially was a booth equipped to measure height, weight, chest width, arm strength, hearing, and other various variables. This laboratory eventually collected the measurements of 9,337 individuals, more precisely, sets of parents and their children. Galton was also interested in measuring the intelligence of his test subjects to prove whether there was a causal relationship between parents and children. He acknowledged, however, that intelligence was too difficult to quantify and thus focused solely on physical characteristics. Galton published his data and findings in 3 consecutive papers in 1885, 1886, and then a 2-year gap to 1888. In these works, the statistician was able to demonstrate that the distribution of anthropometric variables, such as height, followed the so-called normal law. This law dictates that approximately 68% of data in a set falls within 1 standard deviation of the means. 95% of the data will fall within 2 standard deviations of the mean, and 99.7% will be within 3 standard deviations. And there's a nice little graph that I can see, which, sure, like, put that in behind me so everyone can see this graph that we're all going to pretend to understand. Look, it's all very complicated, and I'm sure statisticians are mocking me in the comments, but this is how I see it. The majority of people are just average, except you. You are exceptional. If you're watching this, you've got good taste and presumably a very large penis. Well done. As an exceptionally gifted audience craving for knowledge, you'll be happy to also know that in his 1888 paper, Galton first introduced another key concept of statistics: correlation. I quote once again, "Two variable organs are said to be correlated when the variation of one is accompanied on the average by more or less the variation of the other, and in the same direction. Correlation must be the consequence of variations in the two organs being partly due to common causes." I've not had enough coffee. Galton's writings inspired many to pursue studies in hereditary biometrics and biostatistics, but the field which garnered the most attention was, of course, eugenics. But with the help of his disciple Karl between 1901 and 1908, Galton founded the Galton Laboratory for National Eugenics and the Galton Eugenics Professorship, as well as journals Biometrica and the Eugenics Review. The latter in particular gained many followers in Europe and the United States, but Galton's greatest success was the conference he presented at the Sociological Society of London in 1904, entitled, simply, Eugenics, its definition, its goals, and its aspirations, an event often quoted as the official birth date of the eugenics movement. At the conference, well attended by notable doctors and sociologists, Galton advocated for eugenics to become a scientific discipline in its own right. It was meant to be taught at universities to be introduced as, and I quote again, into the national consciousness as a religion. In Galton and Pearson's vision, the new discipline would ensure that humanity will be represented by the fittest races. Eugenics should cooperate with nature to ensure the improvement of, and I quote, human stock by regulating marriage and procreation. We should clarify that the reforms proposed by Galton could be categorised as positive eugenics, if such a term is possible to exist. For example, research programs to identify and treat hereditary diseases, or tax schemes encouraging intelligent people to marry and reproduce. But as this discipline took hold, many of its followers appeared interested in its darker side, so-called negative eugenics measures, which advocate for the eradication of the unfit elements of society, for example via mass sterilisation programs. You can probably see where this one's going. Francis Galton was knighted in 1909, becoming Sir Francis, and in 1910 he received the prestigious Copley Medal from the Royal Society. But this would be his last triumph. On January 7th, 1911, Sir Francis Galton drew his last breath in Haslemere, Surrey. He left behind a manuscript for a utopian novel describing a world where society had been greatly improved by eugenics. Albeit founded on the wrong premises, his studies had been driven by good intentions. Unless you remember the working class, I suppose. He could not have imagined how the dark side of his science, negative eugenics, would degenerate into dystopia. Shortly after Sir Francis's death, his spiritual heir, Karl Pearson, continued to organise congresses on eugenics, attended and supported by political and intellectual leaders such as Winston Churchill, John Maynard Keynes, G.B. Shaw, H.G. Wells, Alexander Graham Bell, and Woodrow Wilson. In the UK, negative eugenics measures were narrowly avoided. In 1912, the Parliament debated a mental deficiency bill, which included an amendment prohibiting marriage among those deemed feeble-minded. The amendment was removed, but the Eugenics Society pressured the Ministry of Health to consider making sterilisation legal. These efforts climaxed with the publication of a paper titled Sterilisation of the Unfit in April 1929. Luckily, the British government resisted pressures to enact such measures. Negative eugenics, however, successfully took hold in the US and Sweden. In 1922, the Swedish government was the first to create an institute for racial biology. That's not a horrifying concept or term at all. Which conducted mass sterilisations on mentally ill individuals and later on women in vulnerable social circumstances. The programme was shut down only in 1976 after an estimated 60,000 people were forcibly sterilised against their will. As for the US, the American Eugenics Society, because of course that existed, advocated for the forced sterilisation of 10% of the population, mostly mental patients and the poorest elements of society, especially African American citizens, because, never change America. The US government conducted 60,000 forced sterilisations before the scientific community successfully lobbied to close the programme in 1936. American eugenicists would find fertile soil for their ideas, though, in Nazi-era Germany. As early as July 1933, Adolf Hitler enacted the law for the prevention of the hereditarily diseased offspring. And it's worth noting that this law was inspired specifically by the success of a similar scheme in California, documented by the American geneticist P.B. Popenoe? You're really going to be walking around with that name and thinking you're superior to other people, like Popenoe. The Third Reich enacted both positive and negative eugenics. Why? There's going to be so many bad sound clips in this one. Positive eugenics materialised as the Lebensborn programme, which oversaw the forced breeding of children of pure Aryan descent. Negative measures resulted in the sterilisation of up to 375,000 individuals. It could also be argued that the wholesale massacre of millions of undesirables perpetuated by the Nazi authorities was essentially a eugenics programme on an industrial, almost unfathomable scale. The other great dictatorship of the time, Stalin's Soviet Union, was also swept by enthusiasm for eugenics. Surprisingly, however, the other big mustachioed murderer of the 20th century was never a fan of sterilising and suppressing undesirables, as his country faced a demographic crisis following World War I and the Civil War. Soviet scientists dedicated their resources to instead positive eugenics until Stalin decreed the practice to be fascist science. So I guess you got give it to Stalin on that one. In the early 1930s, dismantling all related programmes. This concludes our overview of the life, works and legacy of Sir Francis Galton. We realised we were only able to regress towards the norm when it comes to describing such complex scientific concepts. For a more in-depth understanding of Galton's life and discoveries, we encourage you to check out the sources in the description below. If you missed anything or got anything wrong, please keep us honest in the comments, citing additional sources if possible. And yeah, thank you for tuning into this episode of Biographics. As noted at the start, the article this video is based on was by Arnaldo Teodrani. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And I've been your host, Karl Smallwood. This has been a very harrowing recording time, 38 minutes for myself. I might need to stand up and go for a walk around because that is legit. I feel dirty just saying all those words out loud. But if you have enjoyed this video and found it interesting, if darkly so, leave a like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. Follow us on social media, and as always, have the day you deserve. Cheers.